In this video, we're going to be demonstrating the different ways in which you can animate your 3D text in Blender. So the first thing we're going to do is create our 3D text that we're going to animate. I'm just going to hide my default cube, and then I'm going to hit Shift and A to bring up my Add menu. Now, text objects are their own unique object types, so they're different to mesh objects. Come down here and select text to add your text object to your scene. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to press the 7 key on my number pad to go into my top orthographic view. So I'm looking at my scene from a top down view. I'm then going to hit tab, and we're going to just use a couple of new words here rather than the default text. I'm going to go Animate, Blender, press tab to come out of edit mode, and then I'm just going to go to this icon here for the object data properties, come to where it says geometry, and I'm just going to give it a little bit of thickness. So what are the different ways in which we can animate our 3D text? Well, the first method is to animate your transforms. As text is an object type, it has the transform attributes of location, rotation, and scale. If we press the N key on our keyboard, we can see the transform values here. So we have our location, rotation, and scale, the same as with our mesh objects. I'm also going to bring up the timeline, which is located underneath. So I'm going to come over to the intersection between the timeline and the 3D viewport. I'm going to click and drag up, just so I can see a bit of my timeline. So the first animation that we're going to create, and we're going to keep these as simple as possible so we can get through as many as we can. I'm just going to create an animation where my text falls onto this red line that represents the x-axis. To do that, I'm going to first of all change the y value, because the green line here represents the y-axis and I want to push this up on the y-axis. I'm going to increase the y value to, let's go, 4. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a keyframe. Keyframes are used to indicate the start and end points of each animation that you create. I'm currently on frame 1, so what I'm going to do is I can either press the I key in my 3D viewport to open the Insert Keyframe menu, or more simply, I can just press the I key by hovering over my location values. So if I press I, you will see that the X, Y, and Z axes for my location have now been changed to a yellowish highlight. This indicates that we have an active keyframe on this frame. The next step is to create an end keyframe. For my example, I'm going to go to frame 60, so I can just left click to position my active frame wherever I want, or I can type the value in here. And then I'm going to change the value on the y-axis. So I'm going to left click and type in 0 and press enter. The Y channel now appears orange, like a darkish orange colour. This indicates that we have made a change to this value, but the keyframe has not been confirmed. The other two axes, X and Y, are green. This indicates that we are not on an active keyframe, but the values themselves have not actually changed here. We're going to press the I key again, and now they will all appear yellow. This indicates that we have inserted a keyframe on frame 60, which is what we're currently on. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to just set my end frame from 250 down to 60. And then I'm going to go back to the start of my animation by clicking this option here and press play. So now we have an animation of our text falling down onto the red line. This is a very simple example of being able to animate your text in Blender. Let's take a look at some more. So now let's take a look at the rotation values. I want to create an animation where my text spins 360 degrees, and I want it to spin from the center. Before I can do that though, I need to get rid of my location keyframes. I can do that by just hovering my mouse cursor over the timeline, press X to bring up the delete menu, and then select delete keyframes. Now if I do this and I'm not on my original frame, what's going to happen is Blender is just going to use the active frame and the values of that frame as the new positioning for our text. So in this case, it's set to 1.25. I'm just going to left click and type in 0 and enter. Now when it comes to rotation and scale, the object origin, which is the yellow dot here, is used as the pivot point for the rotation and scale, unless you choose to change your pivot point here. So you can have various options here for how you want to rotate and scale your objects. I want to use my pivot point, but if I was to create my animation here, so I'll go back to frame 1 as an example, hit I to insert a keyframe for my rotation, go to frame 60, and then I'm going to use a value I want it to rotate all the way around to minus 360 and press enter. Then insert my keyframe and go back to the start and press play. You can see that we're rotating, but we're not rotating from the center of the text. We're rotating from this origin point here, which is at the start of the first letter. I want to change this, so how do I get the text into the center? Well, the easiest way to do that is actually in your properties panel. So in the object data tab, what we're going to do is we're going to just close up this geometry section, and below that we have the paragraph section and alignment. We can define the horizontal and vertical alignment, which is currently set to left and top baseline. For the horizontal alignment, left click and then select center. You can see straight away that our Animate Blender text has now moved, but the object's origin remains in place. So now on the horizontal axis, the object origin is found in the center of our text. This is good, but it's not perfect. We need it to be in the center of the text vertically as well to get our rotation. So we're going to change our vertical alignment from top baseline to center. And that will just bring our text down a little bit. And now, if I was to press play, you can see that we are animating our text and it's rotating 360 degrees from the center point. Scale is the third transform that we can animate with our text. Let's say, for example, I want to create an animation for my text where it starts off being really stretched and eventually it becomes its regular size. First of all, I'm just going to delete my rotation keyframes just to make sure that we are keeping things as simple as possible. And then we're going to increase our scale. Now, if I increase on the y-axis, because we're looking at it from a top-down view, you can see we're beginning to stretch our text. We can stretch it along the x-axis as well, but I'm going to go y for now. I'm going to use a value of 8. And once again, I can just add a keyframe for this value by pressing the I key on my keyboard. Then I'll go to frame 60. And actually, let's make a slightly more complex animation here. So let's actually reduce this so that it goes below a value of 1. And then it comes back up to its regular size. So I'm going to go down to keyframe 40 this time. I'm going to set the Y value to 0.5 and press enter. and you'll see that we're starting to squash our text. Press I, and then we're going to create a third keyframe at frame 60. So effectively we're going to go with two motions. We're going to first of all squash our text and then expand it. So at frame 60 we're going to set the Y value to 1 and press enter. Then we're going to hit the I key to insert the keyframe. We now have 3 keyframes which will allow us to create 2 motions. If we go back to the start, you can see it's currently stretched. If I press play, it's going to squash, then come back. So those are a few examples of being able to animate the transforms of your text. But there are also other things that we can animate as well. Let's reduce this back to its default state. So we can do that by setting the Y value back to 1 and then pressing X and deleting the keyframes. In our properties panel, we have a wide variety of attributes that we can edit. Many of these attributes we can even animate. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to orbit my view just so we can see the 3D extrusion of our text. And this time I actually think I'm going to just rotate this on the x-axis by a value of 90. Press the period key so that we focus on our text, and that just gives us a good view of our Animate Blender text here. So in our properties panel, if we just open up the geometry section first of all, you will notice that some of these attributes have little white dots next to them. If you see a little white dot next to an attribute, it means that attribute can be animated. So let's take the extrude option for example. I'm going to reset this back to 0 so we have just 2-dimensional text. If I left click on this white dot, I'm going to animate this property or this attribute. The value is highlighted yellow and the white dot becomes a larger white diamond. Then I'm going to go up to frame 40 again, so let's do something similar to our scale. And I'm going to increase my extrusion to 0.1 and press enter. Then I'm going to click on the diamond again, and you can see it's hollow to indicate that there is a keyframe for this value, but not on this active frame, and that we have changed this value so that we need to confirm it by clicking on this hollow diamond here. Now that that is confirmed, let's go to frame 60 and let's reduce this to a value of 0.5. Then add our keyframe. Now if we go back to the start and press play, we create a keyframe and an animation for the extrusion property of our text. But while we can animate many of these properties or attributes for our text, not all of them work well by themselves. For example, we are actually able to create keyframes for the alignment values. However, there is a slight issue with doing this by itself. So I'm just going to again delete my keyframes for my extrusion. I'm just going to go to frame 1 and we're going to create a keyframe for our vertical alignment. So we've created our keyframe. Let's now go to frame 30. You'll see it's now green. We're going to left click, make a change. We're going to go top and create a keyframe. And when we set the vertical alignment to the top, it actually pushes the text underneath. We're going to go to 60, change this to bottom and create the keyframe. Now you might think that it would be similar to the transforms where it would just gradually go to one keyframe and then to the next. But watch what happens. If I press play, it snaps to each one. And to make that a little bit easier to view, let's just increase to frame 90 for our animation. Snap, snap. So even though we can animate many of these properties, they don't work as well, or some of them don't work as well as you would perhaps think. So it's a good idea to always experiment with any properties that you can animate to see what effects you can create. For now, let's now take a look at the options below. So here we have our spacing options. Now these we can animate quite well. So I'm just going to, once again, delete my keyframes. The character spacing, or kerning, defines how much space there is between each individual letter. If we increase this value, all of the letters get more space in between them. We can also see that we are using our alignment options here to define where the spacing is being created. So it's being created from our origin. The word spacing will control the distance between the words that we create. Blender is smart enough to know that whenever we use the spacebar, we're creating a different word each time. So it recognizes that Animate and Blender are two different words, and we can control the space in between these words. Line spacing we can't see here because we're only using one line. So very quickly, I'm just going to add a second line. So now we have two lines. Animate Blender because it's awesome. I'm going to go back into my object mode and increase my line spacing. And you can see we're now increasing the space between the top and bottom lines. You can also see that we are able to animate each of these. So let's just go back in time a little bit and get rid of that bottom line. And with word spacing, we could do something like this, where we have our two words relatively far apart. We could create a keyframe, and then if we come to frame 60, reduce that to 1, create another keyframe, go back to the start, and we create an animation where our words will come in and join together. You can also do this, of course, with your character spacing and your line spacing. So these are useful tools to animate if you're creating title sequences. Next, I'm going to again delete the keyframes, and I'm going to open up this font section. Now in the font section we have these transform values, and two that we can change here are the size and shear of our text. The size is similar to scaling, but on all three axes, or rather on two axes, the X and Y. It actually ignores the extrusion of your text, so if we increase the size, you can see it gets bigger, but the extrusion does not, which in this case lies on the Z axis, mainly because it's been rotated 90 degrees. Now what we can do here is we can animate this value. So for example, we could animate the size at a value of 1, and then we could create a pulsing effect every 20 frames. So I could increase this to 2 at frame 20 and create my keyframe. At frame 40, I could use a value of 0.5, create a keyframe. At 60, we'll go back to 2. At frame 80, go back to 0.5, always create a keyframe, and then at frame 100, so we'll go to 120 now for our end frame, we can reset this to 1. Create the keyframe, go back to the start and press play, and we create a pulsing effect for our text. Probably slightly exaggerated with our size values, might want to go a bit smaller than that, but we get the effect that we're looking for. Now the one below that is the shear. I like to use this one when I'm sliding text into view. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to once again just delete the keyframes, and I'm going to position my viewport and hit Control, Alt and 0 on my number pad. This allows me to see my scene through my camera. What I like to do here is I like to manipulate these offset values. So we have the X and Y offset values, which moves the text but doesn't move the origin point. It's similar to moving your geometry in edit mode for your mesh objects. The shear value allows us to sort of lean our text in one direction or the other. What I like to do here is I like to move my text to the side so it's just off screen, and then I'll increase my shear to 1. I'll create my animation, so I'll create a keyframe for my offset, and I'll also create a keyframe for my shear. I'll then move to frame 80 in this case. Let's go a little bit quicker than that. Let's go 60. And at this point, I will move the offset back to 0. Then I will create a keyframe for the offset. And this is a very simple example. I would edit this a bit more if I had more time. I would keep the shear as 1. So I'd create a keyframe but not change the value. Then I would go to another keyframe, say frame 70. And I would reduce the shear to -1. So it goes from one direction to the next when it reaches that stop point, when the offset reaches 0. I'd create my keyframe, go to frame 80 perhaps, set to a positive value again, but this time not as high, maybe 0.3, create my keyframe, and then let's go about frame 94, set to 0, create my keyframe. So if I go back to the start, our text slides in and then it sort of wobbles into place. Now there are a couple of things that I would change there. I'd probably go into the graph editor and edit how the shear begins, because there's sort of like a little delay there. But you can get the idea of what you can do by combining your keyframes, such as with the shear and the offset tools. It always helps to think outside of the box. And when animating your text, you don't just need to think about the text itself, but also what else is in your scene. You can think about the lighting, for example, the camera, or the materials of your text. In Blender, we are able to give our text materials. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just reset these values. So I'm going to make sure that shear is set to 0. And I'm going to create text that is slightly transparent so that you can see through it. I'm also going to animate this value so that it starts off where it's just completely opaque and then it will gradually fade out. So I'm going to create a fade out effect for my animation. To do that, I'm just going to create a little bit of a scene here. So I'm going to move up my text. I'm going to create a plain object and scale it by 10. I think the text needs to come up a little bit more here. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the shading workspace where we can see our text. And I'm going to click on the new button to create a new material. For this material, I'm going to add 2 nodes. So again, we're keeping things very simple here. I'm going to hit Shift A, and the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add a mix shader. So we're going to select the mix shader option and position it here in between the material output and the principled BSDF shader node. I'm then going to add a transparent node to this setup. Again, Shift and A. We're going to go shader and select transparent. I'm going to position it here and connect it to the second shader slot for the mix shader node. Now you can only see this in your rendered view. So I'm just going to change my rendered color to, or my base color to red. I'm going to go to rendered view, and I'm just going to change my render engine to cycles because it will work with transparency straight away. If we just zoom in a little bit, you can see there's a little bit of transparency with our text. If I manipulate this factor value to 0, then it's going to favor my principled BSDF shader entirely, so it's opaque. If I increase this all the way up to 1, the text becomes transparent. So if I just left click away, the text effectively disappears. So I can manipulate this value to manipulate the amount of transparency of my text. This is useful because we can use this to create a fade in, fade out animation. I'm going to set this to 1 to start off with. And I don't have a timeline here, so I'm just going to, first of all, create that timeline in our workspace. So I'm going to create a horizontal split, left click, and just change this to my timeline. We'll drag it up a tad. Also drag up the shader editor just a bit. I'm going to go to frame 1, and I'm going to hit the I key where we have our factor value. So if I press I, you can see the color changes and we've created a keyframe. So any of these numerical values you see here, they can be animated. And actually, so can color attributes as well. So you can animate your color as well as these numerical values here. I'm going to go to frame 20. Actually, let's go frame 25. And I'm going to hit the I key again without changing my factor value. So I'm starting off with it staying completely transparent for a couple of seconds. Press I, and you'll notice that we actually cannot see any keyframes, and the reason why is because I actually deselected my text in the viewport. So I'm just going to left click, and if we go back to the start, we can see we've got our keyframes here. So they're not showing in our timeline at this point, but we do have those keyframes. So if I go to frame 30, or rather 40, let's go 40, I can then reduce this to 0, hit I to create my keyframe, then we'll go to about frame 90, we'll press I again, so during this period it will be completely opaque. Go to frame, we'll go frame 105, increase to 1, and press I, and then towards the end we'll create one more keyframe here. So if we go back to the start and press play, you can see that we have our fade in effect for our text. I'm just going to deselect it, and you can see in real time we have the fade in effect and then fade out. And that's just one example of being able to use the material data to animate your text. Along with animating our material data, we can also animate the lighting as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually just going to get rid of my material by pressing the X key, and that will get rid of the keyframes as well. And then I might as well just add in a second material so that we can see. Let's make it blue this time. And I want to animate my light source. So I'm going to come back to my layout workspace, and I'm just going to select the light object. Now in the object data tab of the properties panel, which now looks like a light bulb, we have the different light types. For this example, I'm going to use spot. If I go back into rendered view, you can see we've got a spot lamp effect. I'm just going to reduce the spot size so that it's smaller. And there are different ways in which we can do this. I'm going to make it as simple as possible. I'm just going to create one where we can move our light across like this. So I'm going to start here. And in this case, I would simply add keyframes to my location. But you'll notice we can also add keyframes to the power of our light source, the radius, which determines how sharp this spot here is, as well as these general spot size, blend values, etc. So once again, there's a lot here that we are able to animate. If I just create my keyframe for my location at frame 1, then we're just going to go to frame, let's go frame 90 here. Let's move our light across the x-axis to about here and create a keyframe. And if we go back, we're going to view through our camera, press 0 on the number pad, and I'm just going to go to the world properties tab here and just reduce the strength value of the world itself to 0. So now we have one light source in our scene. Now if I press play, we get a spotlight style animation. So as you can see, there are many different ways that we can create text animations in Blender. But what if we wanted to animate individual letters? That seems a little bit harder when we are effectively working with singular text objects. Well, the best method is to actually separate your letters into individual objects. This requires several steps. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to revert things back a little bit, set the strength to 1. For our light, let's just go back, make sure that the light itself is selected. Let's go back to a point light. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to select my object, and I want every single one of these to be a single letter. Now we can't do this, or should I say a single object per letter. Now we can't do this if we are using a text object. At this point, we're now going to need to convert it into a mesh object, which allows us to create a whole another level of animations, even just by converting the words themselves. What we're going to do is we're going to go to the object menu, and from here we're going to go down to where it says convert and select mesh. Now if we hit the tab key for our animate blender text, you can see it has been converted into a mesh object with geometry. The geometry itself is not very clean, so we're just going to do a little bit of tidying up here. I'm going to go back into object mode, add a modifier, and I'm going to use the decimate modifier. I'm going to choose the planar option, so you can see our face count is currently set to around 3100 for our text. I'm going to select planar, and without changing anything, the face count goes down to 903. So the planar option actually works really well with text-based objects right out of the gate. You can increase the angle limit to decrease the number of faces, but keep an eye on your text as you're moving this value. You don't want the text to begin deforming, which for me it does so at around 9.5 to 10. So I'm going to go to a relatively safe value, say 8 degrees. And this gives me a face count of 643, about a little over 1/5 of what it was before. Then I'm going to left click here and apply my decimate modifier. I'm going to hit tab, and you can see we have a lot less geometry now. But there are going to be a few of these vertices that are a bit too close together and not really needed. So another thing I'm going to do to clean up my geometry is to select everything in edit mode, hit M, select by distance. Straight away, we remove over 1,000 vertices on our model. Most of these are going to be doubles that are found in the same location. I can also increase the merge by distance value, but keep in mind, as you might have spotted with the T, that increasing the value too much too soon is going to deform your letters. So I'm going to use 0.001, and that's just going to remove just enough vertices here. Let's maybe try and go a little bit higher. Let's go 2. And that's probably clean enough topology to work with. So the next step here is going to be to separate all of these letters into their individual mesh objects. To do that, we're going to go into edit mode, and with everything selected, and if nothing's selected, you can press the A key to select it all. We're going to hit P this time. That's going to bring up the separate menu. So we can separate by selection, material, or loose parts. Select loose parts, and now every single one of our letters here is a separate object. And actually, in the case of the I, we've split it up into 2 objects. So if you use this method and you want to keep these together, just select them both, hit Ctrl J to join them up, and now the I is a single object. There is one problem though. If you want to animate these individual letters, you have to keep in mind that after we separate them, they all have the exact same object origin location. So the final step before you can begin animating these letters is going to be to reset the origin of each letter. To do this, I'm just going to move the light out of the way, and I'm going to just box select all of the letters. So all of these get selected here. Next, I'm going to go to Object in the header bar. I'm going to go to Set Origin, and then I'm going to go Origin to Geometry. As you can see, as we zoom in on our text, all of our letters now have their own object origin, which they did before, but it was always in the same location. But now, all of these letters have an object origin in the center of that letter, depending on where the geometry is based, allowing you to grab, rotate, and scale your letters independently of each other, and allowing you many more potential animation avenues.